My parents spent $165,000 on my brother Marcus and his medical school tuition. When I begged them for just a fraction of that support, they looked me dead in the eye and told me that a man needs the degree more than I do and that girls do not need degrees anyway. They told me to just find a rich husband who could take care of me. Well, I certainly did not find a husband. Instead, I actually worked 4 jobs, graduated from medical school, and built my own private equity empire. Years later, at my brother Marcus and his lavish engagement party, my father stood up and introduced him as our successful child and the absolute pride of our bloodline. He had no idea his wealthy new fiancée was actually my former patient. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your true worth and value. The air inside the Buckhead Country Club was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the quiet hum of old money. This was Atlanta high society at its finest, a world my parents had clawed their way into and were desperately terrified of losing. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the room, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the champagne flutes held by dozens of well-dressed guests. I stood near the back of the grand ballroom, nursing a glass of sparkling water, wearing a tailored emerald green silk suit that I had purchased just for this occasion. The suit was flawless, radiating the kind of quiet power that my family was entirely blind to. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my older brother Marcus and his engagement to Sarah, a woman from a prominent, wealthy white family. For my parents, Harrison and Vivian, this event was not just a party. It was a coronation. It was their ultimate validation, their proof that they had successfully engineered the perfect high-status lineage. They buzzed through the crowd, schmoozing with local politicians and hospital administrators, acting as though they owned the entire building. From my secluded corner, I watched the spectacle unfold. I watched Marcus work the room, flashing his perfectly veneered smile, shaking hands, and playing the role of the humble, brilliant surgeon to absolute perfection. It was a role he had practiced his entire life, funded by my parents' endless financial sacrifices and their unwavering toxic loyalty to their golden son. I took a slow breath, feeling the smooth silk of my jacket against my skin. The journey to this room had been paved with broken promises and shattered expectations. I remembered the nights I spent sleeping in my battered sedan between my shifts as a hospital janitor and my morning classes. I remembered the hunger, the exhaustion, and the profound isolating silence from the people who were supposed to love me most. While Marcus was driving a brand new sports car and failing his exams on a tropical island, I was fighting for my survival. But standing here tonight, I felt no sorrow. I only felt a cold, calculating anticipation, the kind of clarity that comes right before a storm breaks. The clinking of silverware against crystal snapped my attention back to the center of the room. My father Harrison had stepped up to the front, taking the microphone from the wedding planner. He adjusted his expensive tuxedo jacket, puffing his chest out as the room quieted down to listen. His voice boomed through the speakers, deep and resonant, dripping with the kind of arrogant pride that I knew all too well. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, raising his champagne glass high. "We are gathered to celebrate the union of 2 wonderful families, and more importantly, to celebrate my son. Marcus Jr. has always been a trailblazer. From the moment he could walk, we knew he was destined for greatness. He is the absolute pride of our bloodline, a successful, brilliant surgeon who has dedicated his life to healing others. He is a shining example of Black excellence and a true testament to the sacrifices his mother and I have made." The crowd erupted into polite applause. Marcus bowed his head in mock humility, pulling Sarah close to his side. My mother Vivian stood next to them, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. It was a masterful performance, a beautiful illusion of success and prestige. But then my father and his eyes scanned the room, searching through the sea of faces until they landed directly on me. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced instantly by a familiar dismissive sneer. The microphone was still close to his mouth, and he did not bother to lower it. "And then there is Maya, my father announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The entire room turned their heads, their eyes following his gaze to where I stood in my emerald suit. He chuckled, a harsh grating sound. She did not exactly want to pursue a real degree like her brother. But hey, at least she wore a nice outfit tonight to hopefully catch a husband who can finally take care of her. Remember, sweetheart, you do not need to worry about being smart when you can just find someone to pay the bills. Awkward, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the ballroom. Guests exchanged sideways glances, their expressions a toxic mix of pity and secondhand embarrassment. My mother smirked openly and clearly enjoying the public humiliation. Marcus offered a condescending, sympathetic shrug to his wealthy future new relatives, silently writing me off as the family burden. They expected me to shrink to accept my role as the scapegoat and to quietly slip out the back door in shame. But I was not a weak teenager anymore. I stepped forward into the center. Before my heel connected with the marble floor, my mother materialized from the crowd. Vivian moved like a shark whenever she sensed a threat to her social standing. Her manicured fingers clamped down on my bicep, digging into the silk of my jacket. She pulled me aggressively, attempting to drag me into the shadows near the service doors. The scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating, bringing back a rush of painful childhood memories where that exact scent preceded a harsh scolding or a sudden slap. "What are you doing?" Vivian hissed, her voice a tight, venomous whisper meant for my ears. She glanced nervously toward the center of the room, where Marcus was laughing loudly with older, wealthy white men holding cigars. "Stop making a scene and get to the back right now. Go into the kitchen and see if the catering staff needs help carrying out the prime rib. You are taking up space meant for actual paying guests." I looked down at her hand, gripping my arm, then back up to her face. She was deadly serious. My mother wanted me to act as catering help at my brother's engagement party just to keep me out of sight. "Are you still answering phones at that ghetto clinic?" Vivian continued, her tone dripping with disgust. "Because you cannot afford this suit on a receptionist's salary. Listen to me carefully, Maya. Do not embarrass us in front of Sarah or her family tonight. She comes from old money in Buckhead. She is white, wealthy, and connected to half the hospital board members in Atlanta. She does not need to know my daughter is a failure. She does not need to know you threw away a good marriage prospect with a judge just to scrub hospital floors and live in poverty." The memory of that judge flashed through my mind. He was 20 years older than me, arrogant and controlling, but he had political ties my father wanted to exploit for his failing business ventures. When I refused to marry him at 19, my parents packed my belongings in garbage bags and locked me out of the house in the middle of a freezing rainstorm. They told me I would never amount to anything without a rich man to elevate my social status. They told me I would be scrubbing floors for the rest of my miserable life. I calmly raised my hand and wrapped my fingers firmly around her thin wrist. I squeezed steadily, applying just enough pressure to let her know the power dynamic between us had permanently shifted. Vivian gasped softly, her eyes widening in shock as I effortlessly peeled her tight hand off my arm. I did not break eye contact as I smoothed out the invisible wrinkles on my emerald silk sleeve. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, strong, and meticulously clean. These hands did not answer phones for minimum wage. These hands did not hold a dirty mop or scrub linoleum floors for spare change. These hands had spent the last 10 hours operating on a critical brain aneurysm. These hands held surgical scalpels, navigated microscopic blood vessels, and successfully pulled desperate people back from the absolute brink of death. They were the highly skilled hands of a chief neurosurgeon. But my mother Vivian could not see that. She was too blinded by her desperate need for validation from high society to see the incredible reality standing right in front of her. I stepped around her, ignoring her quiet, sputtering protests and the way she frantically adjusted her pearl necklace. The opulent room was still buzzing with the aftermath of my father's arrogant toast, but the energy shifted as I walked purposefully toward the grand gift table. The large table was situated right next to where Marcus and Sarah were standing, holding court like modern royalty. It was piled high with silver-wrapped boxes, tall crystal vases, and thick envelopes holding generous checks from the Atlanta elite. Marcus saw me approaching, and his fake practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly plastered it back on. He puffed out his chest instinctively, preparing to put me in my place, just like he always did when we were kids. He probably expected me to hand him a cheap toaster or a $20 gift card and beg for a tiny scrap of his attention. He expected me to bow down to his golden child status. Instead, I reached into my designer clutch. My fingers brushed past my hospital security badge and my premium credit cards, finally finding the thick, heavy manila envelope I had brought specifically for this occasion. I pulled it out, holding it up high so the bright overhead chandelier light caught the bold red lettering stamped across the front. I wanted absolutely everyone to see it clearly before I made my final move. I dropped the envelope onto the pristine white tablecloth. It landed with a loud, heavy thud that cut sharply through the gentle jazz music playing in the background. My father stopped mid-sentence in his conversation with a city councilman, his jaw tightening. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp from the edge of the room, her worst nightmare unfolding in real time. Marcus stared at the envelope, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What is this, Maya?" he asked, his voice carrying a low warning tone meant to intimidate me into immediate silence. He took a threatening step toward me, trying to use his height to tower over me. I smiled, letting my voice project clearly and confidently across the suddenly quiet space. "It is a wedding gift for Marcus," I said loudly, ensuring that Sarah, her wealthy parents, and every single person standing within earshot could hear my words perfectly. Since he is such a successful doctor with such a brilliant, lucrative career, I figured he should probably pay his 4-month overdue rent. That is an eviction notice. The jazz music did not just fade, it screeched to a halt as the hired band leader caught the sudden heavy tension suffocating the room. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy. You could have heard a crystal pin drop on the polished marble floor. I watched the realization wash over Marcus. His handsome, perfectly manicured face drained of color before flooding with a violent mottled red. The facade of the polished, brilliant surgeon shattered in an instant, revealing the spoiled, deeply insecure boy underneath. He lunged toward me, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. He stopped mere inches from my face, attempting to use his 6'2" frame to intimidate me into submission. It was a cowardly tactic he had used since we were teenagers, trying to physically dominate any space where his fragile ego was threatened. I could smell the heavy, expensive cologne he used to mask the nervous sweat now gathering at his temple. But I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked directly up into his eyes, watching the terror swim beneath his fury. "What is wrong with you, Marcus?" hissed his voice, trembling with a toxic mix of rage and pure panic. "You are completely insane. You come into my engagement party, my special night, looking for a handout, and decide to throw a tantrum because I am actually making something of myself. Security!" he yelled over his shoulder, projecting his voice for the stunned crowd. "Someone get security to escort my sister out. She is clearly unwell. Just a jealous, broke hater trying to ruin my life because she has absolutely nothing going for her." He pointed a shaking manicured finger at the manila envelope resting on the gift table. "I do not know what fake documents you printed out at the public library, Maya, but you are pathetic. You are a bitter, floor-scrubbing nobody who cannot handle the fact that I am an incoming executive partner at a major medical group while you are still playing receptionist. You are a complete embarrassment to this family." Before I could calmly dismantle his pathetic web of lies, my father shoved his way past the bewildered catering staff. Harrison planted himself firmly between me and his golden boy, acting as a physical shield for a 32-year-old man who was actively dodging his rent payments. My father's face was contorted with a kind of raw, vicious rage I had not seen since the night he threw me out into the freezing winter storm all those years ago. "How dare you!" Harrison spat, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper that echoed in the deathly quiet ballroom. "How absolutely dare you come here and try to sabotage your brother? Do you have any idea what is at stake tonight, Maya? Do you possess even an ounce of understanding about what this family is achieving right now?" He gestured wildly around the opulent room, his tailored tuxedo pulling tight across his shoulders. This is a historic night for our bloodline. Marcus is bridging a gap that takes generations to cross. We are a successful Black family, joining with one of the most prominent, wealthy white families in Buckhead. We are cementing our legacy, our power, our prestige. Sarah and her family come from money that built this entire city. And you think you can just waltz in here in your little clearance rack suit and throw around fake eviction notices to embarrass us in front of them? You are trying to destroy the empire I sacrificed everything to build. The sheer, unadulterated delusion was staggering. My father was so desperate for high society validation that he was completely ignoring the legal court-stamped document sitting right behind him. He did not care if Marcus was facing a humiliating eviction or drowning in a sea of hidden debt. He only cared about the illusion of perfection. He only cared about the proximity to white wealth and status that Sarah represented. He would gladly throw me under the bus 1,000 times over to protect a son who was nothing but a fraud. You are nothing but a vindictive failure, my father continued relentlessly, pointing a rigid finger toward the ballroom exit. You are dead to me, Maya. I want you out of this building before Sarah and her parents walk through those doors. If they see you, if they hear one single word of this ghetto nonsense you are pulling, you will regret it for the rest of your miserable life. Just as the violent threat left his lips, the massive brass handles of the grand double doors at the ballroom entrance began to turn. The heavy mahogany doors swung open wide, catching the attention of every single guest in the room. There stood Sarah, breathtaking in a custom white silk designer gown, flanked tightly by her parents. Her father possessed the quiet, confident posture of a man who owned entire city blocks, while her mother dripped in understated, elegant diamonds. They paused at the threshold, completely freezing as they caught the unmistakable tail end of my father's aggressive shouting. The ugly, volatile tension in the room hit them like a physical brick wall. The transformation in Marcus was immediate and utterly terrifying. Within a fraction of a second, the raging veins in his neck disappeared. His aggressive, threatening posture melted away like wax near a flame. He plastered on a blinding, charming smile, smoothing down his tuxedo jacket as he completely turned his back on me and my furious father. He rushed toward the entrance, his arms wide open, ready to play the role of the perfect doting future son-in-law. Sarah, darling, Mr. and Mrs. Kensington. Marcus projected his voice loud and smooth, dripping with fake sugary warmth. Welcome. Please excuse the brief commotion. My sister was just leaving. She has always struggled with some serious personal issues and became a bit overwhelmed by the large crowd tonight. Let us get you a glass of vintage champagne and take you out to the terrace away from the noise. He reached out, attempting to gently grab Sarah by the waist and physically turn her away from the center of the room. He was trying to herd them like cattle, desperate to block their line of sight to the gift table, to the eviction notice, and most importantly, to me. He wanted to maintain his carefully constructed lie at all costs. But Sarah did not move. She did not return his blinding smile or accept his outstretched hand. She stood completely frozen, her eyes bypassing Marcus entirely. Her gaze cut straight through the crowd, right past my sweating father, right past my seething mother, and landed squarely on my face. I stood tall, my shoulders pulled back, maintaining my composed posture in the emerald suit. I watched as all the color rapidly drained from Sarah and her beautiful face. Her custom designer clutch slipped from her manicured fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed loudly in the terrible silence. Sarah, honey, what is wrong? Marcus asked, his fake smile faltering as real panic bled back into his voice. He tried to step into her line of vision again, blocking her view. She completely ignored him, her jaw dropped open in absolute, unadulterated shock. Without a single word to her wealthy parents or her desperate, sweating fiancé, Sarah physically pushed past Marcus. She shoved his hand away as if it burned her skin. Tears began welling rapidly in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup as she walked directly toward me, her gaze locked onto mine with absolute, undeniable reverence. Sarah stopped just inches away from me, her chest heaving with choked-back sobs. She did not look at the eviction notice on the table. She did not look at my angry parents. She reached out with both hands and grabbed my fingers, gripping them with a desperate, reverent strength. The massive diamond engagement ring my brother had bought on credit dug sharply into my knuckles, but I did not pull away. "Dr. Maya." Sarah breathed out, her voice trembling so violently that it carried across the dead quiet room. "Oh my God. I cannot believe it is really you. I have been trying to reach your private office for months to invite you to the wedding. My father left 5 messages with your answering service, but your staff said your surgical schedule was completely booked until next year." The silence in the ballroom shattered, replaced by a collective sharp intake of breath from the wealthy guests. The Buckhead elite loved nothing more than proximity to greatness, and Sarah had just announced my status to the entire room. My mother Vivian let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh. It was a shrill, grating sound that she always used when she was trying to smooth over an uncomfortable social situation. She stepped forward immediately, trying to physically wedge herself between me and her future daughter-in-law. Dr. Vivian said, her voice dripping with forced, condescending sweetness. "Sarah, sweetheart, no. You are confused. This is just Maya. She is not a doctor. She just answers phones at a little clinic down in the city. She probably wears scrubs to feel important, but I promise you she is just a receptionist. You must have her mixed up with one of the actual physicians." Sarah dropped my hands, but she did not back away. Instead, she turned slowly to face my mother. The polite, deferential respect Sarah had shown Vivian all evening vanished instantly. It was replaced by a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. Sarah looked at my mother as if she had just scraped her off the bottom of a very expensive shoe. "Answers phones." Sarah repeated, her voice echoing loudly. Her tone was so sharp and icy that my mother instinctively took a step back. "Are you completely out of your mind, Vivian? She is the chief of neurosurgery at Atlanta General Hospital." A loud gasp rippled through the crowd of onlookers. My father, Harrison, physically stumbled back a step, his jaw hanging slack. But Sarah was not finished. "She is not a receptionist," Sarah continued, her voice rising with fierce protective energy. "3 years ago, every single doctor in this city told me I had an inoperable brain tumor. They told my parents to take me home and make me comfortable because I had less than 6 months to live. This woman," Sarah pointed directly at me, her eyes flashing with angry tears, "is the only surgeon in the entire country who looked at my scans and told me she could fix it. She operated on my brain for 14 hours straight. She saved my life when everyone else gave up. In the medical community, she is an absolute legend." The camera of reality finally snapped into focus for my parents. I watched the profound, horrifying truth hit Harrison and Vivian with the force of a speeding freight train. The daughter they had discarded like trash, the girl they had told would amount to nothing, the woman they had just publicly humiliated over a microphone, was not just successful. I was a top-tier surgeon. I was the chief of neurosurgery. I was the literal savior of the billionaire heiress they were desperately trying to marry their fraudulent son into. Their brains simply could not process the information. My father's eyes darted wildly around the room, looking at the wealthy guests who were now nodding in sudden recognition, whispering my name in hushed, impressed tones. Vivian stared at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her hands shaking at her sides. The foundation of their entire toxic worldview, the belief that Marcus was the supreme golden child and I was the worthless scapegoat, was cracking and crumbling right beneath their designer shoes. They had thrown away the diamond to worship a common rock, and now the entire high society of Atlanta was watching them realize it. Marcus Jr. was completely suffocating under the heavy weight of the room's shifting focus. The spotlight had been violently ripped away from him, and he was drowning in the shadows. He was sweating profusely now, thick beads of moisture rolling down his forehead and soaking into the collar of his custom tuxedo shirt. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He needed to regain control of the narrative before Sarah's parents started asking questions about his own questionable medical career. He pushed past our stunned mother and forced a loud, booming laugh that sounded more like a bark of panic. Okay, Marcus said, clapping his hands together loudly, trying to draw the attention back to his handsome face. "Well, it sounds like Maya got incredibly lucky with one procedure. Good for her. Everybody gets a lucky break sometimes. But let us be honest here and stay grounded in reality. Answering to hospital administrators is one thing, being the boss is another. He puffed out his chest, straightening his posture to look as imposing as possible while he delivered his ultimate trump card. As an incoming executive partner at Vanguard Medical Group, I am the real deal, Marcus bragged, his voice echoing through the ballroom. I am not just practicing medicine, I am buying the hospitals. That takes real business acumen, that is real wealth and real power. He looked at Sarah's parents, flashing a desperate, charming smile, hoping they would be blinded by the mention of the massive private equity firm. He thought the lie would save him. He thought Vanguard Medical Group sounded prestigious enough to bury my accomplishments. I did not feel angry. I felt a slow, deep sensation of absolute victory settle into my bones. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a steel trap. I calmly reached out and took the microphone directly from my father's frozen, trembling hand. The heavy metal of the microphone felt cool and solid in my grip. I stood perfectly still, letting the deafening silence of the ballroom stretch out for a few agonizing seconds. Every single eye in the Buckhead Country Club was pinned on me. I looked at Marcus. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his arrogant smirk melting into a grimace of pure panic. Executive partner at Vanguard Medical Group, I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. That is truly fascinating, Marcus. I had no idea your illustrious surgical career had afforded you the time to pivot so seamlessly into private equity. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. He was cornered, but a narcissist never backs down when they are challenged. They double down. He puffed out his chest again, turning his body slightly to face Sarah and her wealthy parents, desperately trying to keep their attention away from the eviction notice still sitting on the gift table. It is a very exclusive opportunity, Marcus stammered, his voice pitching slightly higher than usual. He plastered on a sickeningly smooth smile, specifically targeting Sarah's father. The paperwork is just being finalized, Arthur. It is a massive commercial buyout of distressed medical real estate. A real game changer for the Atlanta market. I have already secured my position on the board. I simply need a small bridge investment from my future father-in-law just to clear the final escrow hurdles and solidify my partnership share. It is a temporary reallocation of funds, nothing more than a brief formality between family members. A collective murmur rippled through the affluent crowd. The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. He was standing in the middle of his lavish engagement party, actively trying to scam his future in-laws out of a bridge investment to cover the massive debts he was hiding. Sarah's father, Arthur, narrowed his eyes, his sharp business instincts clearly kicking into high gear. He looked at Marcus not like a future son-in-law, but like a very bad investment. A small bridge investment, I repeated, letting a dry, humorless laugh escape my lips. The sound echoed through the speakers. How incredibly on brand for you, Marcus. Because the last time you needed a bridge investment to secure your future, it was my entire college savings account. My mother, Vivian, gasped, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. My father, Harrison, took a threatening step forward, but stopped dead in his tracks when my private security guards subtly shifted their weight at the back of the room. I paced slowly across the polished wooden stage holding the microphone with the absolute authority of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I turned my gaze directly to the sea of wealthy guests, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear precision. Do you remember that, Mom? Dad? I was 18 years old holding an acceptance letter to one of the best universities in the state. I was so proud. But you did not celebrate. Instead, you marched right down to the bank and drained the account my grandmother had carefully set up for my education. You took every single cent and handed it directly to Marcus to pay for his luxury prep courses at a Caribbean medical school. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into the heavy air of the ballroom. I watched Sarah's parents exchange horrified glances while Sarah stared at my brother with growing disgust. When I begged you to leave me just a fraction of that money, I continued, my voice steady and unwavering, so I could at least pay for my textbooks. You looked me dead in the eye and told me that a black man needs the degree much more than I do. You told me my education was a waste of resources. You told me to focus on finding a rich husband because girls do not need to be doctors. They just need to be wives. The silence in the room was absolute. You could feel the collective shock of the high society guests as the pristine facade of the perfect family was ripped away, exposing the toxic rot underneath. So I made a choice, I said, looking directly at Marcus, who was now sweating so profusely his shirt was sticking to his chest. I decided not to rely on anyone. While Marcus was busy failing his basic science exams on a tropical beach and living off our parents' extended credit lines, I was working 4 jobs. I cleaned biohazard spills in the emergency room on the overnight shift. I answered phones at a free clinic. I tutored undergraduate students. I slept in my beat-up sedan in the hospital parking garage between shifts just so I could afford my tuition. And I put myself through undergraduate and medical school entirely on my own. I graduated summa cum laude. I earned my license. I earned my title. I stopped pacing and stood squarely in front of my brother. The contrast between us was glaring. I was standing in my truth, grounded by years of relentless, grueling hard work. He was drowning in a cheap tuxedo held together by lies and stolen money. You claim to be an executive partner, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling register. You claim to be a successful surgeon, but the truly beautiful thing about the medical field is that it relies on absolute transparency. It leaves a very clear, highly verifiable paper trail. I turned my back on his panicked face and walked over to the massive digital projector screen set up behind the stage. Earlier in the evening, it had been displaying a slideshow of Marcus and Sarah's engagement photos, perfectly curated images of a perfectly fake life. I pulled my sleek smartphone from my emerald silk jacket pocket. I swiped down on the screen and tapped the Bluetooth pairing icon, connecting my device directly to the ballroom projector system. The massive screen flickered for a brief second before mirroring my phone display for the entire room to see. Let us take a quick look at the official state medical board registry, I said smoothly, lifting the microphone back to my lips. Shall we? The massive digital screen behind me flared to life, bathing the opulent ballroom in a harsh, sterile blue light. I kept my eyes locked on Marcus as I typed his full legal name into the search bar of the official state medical licensing database. The clicking of my phone keyboard echoed through the sound system, like the ticking of a countdown timer. I hit the search button. The website loaded instantly. The bright red text flashed across the 20-foot screen for every wealthy guest, every hospital board member, and every prospective in-law to see clearly. 0 results found. I let that sit for a moment. The murmurs in the crowd completely died out, replaced by a suffocating heavy silence. I tapped the screen again, switching the search parameters from the state level to the national registry. I typed his name a second time. I hit search. 0 results found. You cannot be an incoming executive partner of a major medical group. Marcus? I said, my voice dropping to a calm, clinical register that cut through the room like a scalpel. And you certainly cannot practice medicine in any hospital in the United States when you do not hold a valid medical license. Marcus was hyperventilating now. He took a stumbling step backward, his hands raised in a pathetic, defensive gesture. Maya, stop! He choked out, his voice cracking. You are messing with the system. It is a glitch. It takes months for the National Registry to update for new attending physicians. Everyone knows that. There is no glitch, Marcus, I replied smoothly, stepping closer to him. You are not a new attending physician. You are not a resident. You are not even a medical school graduate. The color drained entirely from Sarah's face. She grabbed her father's arm for physical support, looking at the man she was supposed to marry as if he were a complete stranger. Let us talk about the USMLE, I said, projecting my voice to the back of the room, ensuring every single person understood the gravity of his lie. The United States Medical Licensing Examination. Step 1 is the absolute foundation of any medical career. You failed it, Marcus. Not once, not twice. You failed it 3 separate times. The Caribbean medical school you attended, the one our parents sacrificed my entire future to pay for, quietly dismissed you exactly 4 years ago due to severe academic inadequacy. You never matched into a residency program. You have spent the last 4 years putting on scrubs every morning, leaving your expensive apartment, and pretending to go to a hospital just to keep up this pathetic charade. Arthur Kensington stepped forward. The wealthy patriarch of Sarah's family moved with a sudden terrifying stillness. He bypassed the sputtering Marcus entirely and walked right up to the stage, his sharp eyes fixed on the glowing blue screen. The old money aristocrat was putting the puzzle pieces together, and the final picture was making him absolutely sick. He turned slowly to face my brother. The disgust radiating from Arthur was so potent you could almost feel it in the air. "If you are not a medical resident," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded total obedience. "If you were dismissed from your program 4 years ago, what exactly did you do with the $165,000 your parents gave you for your medical school tuition?" Marcus flinched as if he had been physically struck. He looked at our father Harrison, whose face was frozen in a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. Harrison had drained my college fund, taken out secondary mortgages, and liquidated his own retirement accounts to hand his golden boy that exact sum of money. Arthur took another step toward Marcus, and more importantly, Arthur continued, his tone turning completely glacial. "What exactly did you intend to do with the bridge investment you were going to ask me for tonight?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a cornered rat trapped in a cage built by his own towering ego. "I am so glad you asked, Arthur," I said, tapping the screen of my phone. "Because a man without a job still has to fund his luxury lifestyle somehow." I swiped to the next tab on my browser. The medical registry vanished, replaced instantly by official county public records. I zoomed in on the first document. It was a vehicle title registration under Marcus Harrison Jr. "This is the title for a brand new Porsche 911, I narrated as the crowd gasped at the image on the screen. "Purchased exactly 3.5 years ago." He bought it entirely in cash right around the time our parents wired him the bulk of his supposed tuition money. But a luxury sports car only accounts for a fraction of that missing $165,000. I swiped again, bringing up a series of heavily redacted bank statements and lien notices that my private investigator had pulled earlier that week. The screen filled with columns of massive rolling debt and desperate wire transfers. The rest of the money went to underground poker rings across the greater Atlanta area. I announced, watching Marcus physically shrink under the glare of the projector. "He has a massive, crippling gambling addiction. He lost his tuition money. He lost the loans he took out in his own name. He lost the rent money for his luxury apartment, which is exactly why there is a court-ordered eviction notice sitting on the gift table over there. He is completely bankrupt, Arthur. He targeted your daughter because marrying into the Kensington wealth was the only way he could pay off the illegal gambling debts he has been hiding from all of us." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Sarah let out a gutted, agonizing sob, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Arthur Kensington looked like he was ready to physically dismantle my brother with his bare hands. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were whispering, pointing, and staring at the Harrison family with naked, unfiltered revulsion. My father looked as though he might drop dead of a heart attack right on the polished marble floor. I stood on the stage, waiting for the inevitable. I waited for my parents to turn on Marcus. I waited for them to finally see the monster they had created, the fraud they had sacrificed me to protect. I waited for them to hold their golden child accountable for stealing their money and destroying their reputation. Instead, a sharp, violent sound cut through the noise of the crowd. It was the sound of a bare hand slamming furiously against solid wood. My mother Vivian stood next to the gift table, her chest heaving, her perfectly styled hair trembling. She did not look at Marcus. She did not look at the undeniable proof of his crimes projected on the 20-foot screen behind me. She turned her entire body toward the stage, her eyes burning with a hateful, irrational fury. She raised her hand, extending a rigid, shaking finger, pointing it directly at me. "You vicious, ungrateful little girl!" Vivian shrieked. Her voice tore through the heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom like shattered glass. She did not turn to face the son, who had just been outed as a degenerate gambler and a monumental fraud. She did not spare a single glance at the 20-foot screen displaying the absolute financial ruin of Marcus. Her wrath was entirely reserved for me. Her finger trembled violently as she stepped closer, her perfectly manicured nails looking like predatory talons ready to strike. "How dare you come in here and air our dirty laundry in front of these people?" Vivian screamed, gesturing frantically towards Sarah's horrified family and the sea of wealthy white guests staring at us in absolute shock. "Have you lost your mind, Maya? You are airing our private family business in front of white folks. You are parading our struggles for everyone to gawk at. You are betraying your own blood." I stared at her, feeling a strange clinical detachment. Her logic was so deeply twisted it was almost fascinating to witness in real time. Marcus had lied about his entire existence. He had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from them. He had scammed his way into a high society engagement to pay off underground poker debts. But in my mother's eyes, the only crime committed tonight was that I had turned on the projector. To her, the truth was not the problem. The fact that the wealthy white elite of Buckhead could see the truth was the unforgivable sin. "You are tearing down everything we worked for." Vivian continued to rant, her chest heaving with every breath. Her pearl necklace rattled against her collarbone. "You think because you wear a fancy title now that you can just walk in here and humiliate your brother? You think you are better than us. You are nothing but a traitor to this family. You should be ashamed of yourself for trying to ruin this beautiful night." Harrison shoved his way past Vivian, his face still a violent shade of crimson. But the sheer panic in his eyes had morphed into a manic, desperate kind of calculation. The gears in his head were grinding visibly. He had just heard Sarah call me the chief of neurosurgery at Atlanta General Hospital. He had just realized that the daughter he threw out into the freezing rain was now wielding massive institutional power. And in his deeply corrupted mind, that power automatically belonged to him. It belonged to the family. It belonged to Marcus. "Maya, you listen to me right now," Harrison barked, stepping so close I could feel the heat radiating from his furious body. "You are going to fix this. You created this catastrophic mess, and you are going to fix it immediately." I tilted my head, watching him unravel. "Fix it?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, fix it," Harrison demanded, waving his hands wildly. "You are a chief surgeon. You sit on the board at a major hospital. You have power. You have connections. You are going to write a letter tonight. You are going to make a few phone calls to your administrative friends, and you are going to get your brother a residency slot at your hospital, right now. You are going to fast-track his paperwork and cover up this ridiculous gap in his resume." The sheer, unadulterated delusion of his demand hung in the air, thick and choking. The ballroom was completely silent, save for the sound of Arthur Kensington muttering something sharp to his private security detail. Harrison did not care who heard him. He was completely blinded by his obsession with salvaging his son's broken image. "You will vouch for him," Harrison continued, his voice rising to a frantic, aggressive shout. "You will tell everyone here that Marcus is a brilliant doctor who just needed a transfer. You will give him a job in your department. If you do not do this right now, Maya, if you refuse to save your brother after you tried to ruin him, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? You are permanently dead to this family." I stood absolutely still, letting the sheer magnitude of their sickness wash over me. The camera of my mind captured the grotesque reality of my parents in high definition. They were not just asking for a simple family favor. They were demanding that I commit a massive federal crime. They were demanding that I risk my hard-earned medical license, my unblemished reputation, and my entire career to cover for a man who had blatantly lied to the state medical board. They wanted me to bring a degenerate gambler and a chronic academic failure into my prestigious hospital. They wanted me to let him anywhere near innocent, vulnerable patients whose lives depended on actual medical expertise. They were perfectly willing to sacrifice everything I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears just to protect the golden boy from facing the very real consequences of his own disastrous actions. It was the exact same toxic dynamic that had governed my entire childhood. Maya must bleed so Marcus can shine. Maya must be emptied out so Marcus can be filled. They would gladly burn my entire life to the ground if it meant keeping Marcus warm for just one more night. They literally expected me to break the law just to uphold their pathetic illusion of status. The absurdity of it all was simply too much to bear. A low sound started in the back of my throat. It bubbled up through my chest, spilling past my lips before I could stop it. I laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was a cold, chilling, razor-sharp sound that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the opulent ballroom. The sound made my mother physically flinch and caused Marcus to take another cowardly step back into the shadows. I looked directly into my father's manic, desperate eyes, refusing to blink. "You think I have the power to hire a fake doctor?" I asked, my voice echoing through the microphone, loud and lethal. "Even if I did, I would not hire him to mop my operating room." The words hung in the sterile air of the ballroom, acting as a final, brutal verdict. I watched the realization wash over the crowd. The high society guests were no longer just witnessing a family dispute. They were watching the absolute implosion of a criminal conspiracy. But no one looked more shattered and simultaneously awakened than Sarah. Throughout my parents' unhinged demands, Sarah had remained frozen beside her father. She had listened to Vivian scream at me for exposing the truth rather than screaming at Marcus for living a lie. She had listened to Harrison demand that I commit medical fraud to cover up his son's spectacular failures. The absolute toxicity, the sheer staggering delusion of the Harrison family dynamic was fully on display. The pristine mask had been ripped away, and Sarah was staring directly at the rotting core. She looked at Marcus. The handsome, charming, successful surgeon she thought she was going to marry, dissolved right in front of her eyes. In his place stood a sweaty, panicked con artist drowning in a cheap tuxedo. Sarah physically recoiled. She took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting distance between herself and the man who had orchestrated this entire illusion. Marcus noticed the shift immediately. His survival instincts kicked in. The inheritance, the bridge loan, the luxurious lifestyle he had planned to leech off the Kensington family wealth, it was all slipping through his fingers. He lunged forward, his hands outstretched in a desperate grasping motion. "Sarah, baby, please," he begged, his voice cracking with a pathetic, shrill edge. "You have to listen to me. It is not what it looks like. My sister is just jealous. She is crazy. We can fix this. I can explain everything." He reached out to grab her bare arm. He never made contact. Arthur Kensington moved with the terrifying speed and lethal precision of a man protecting his only child. He stepped squarely between his daughter and my brother. Arthur planted his hands firmly on Marcus and shoved him backward with a violent, aggressive force. Marcus stumbled, his leather dress shoes slipping on the polished marble floor. He crashed hard into a cocktail table, sending crystal glasses and floral arrangements shattering to the ground. "Do not ever put your hands on my daughter again," Arthur snarled, his voice vibrating with a quiet, murderous rage. "If you take one more step toward her, I will have my security team drag you out of this country club by your teeth, and then I will personally see to it that you are prosecuted for fraud to the fullest extent of the law." Marcus scrambled to find his footing, slipping on spilled champagne and broken glass. He looked up at Sarah, expecting to find the compliant, adoring woman he had manipulated for the last year. Instead, he found a woman who had just realized she was the primary mark in a long con. Sarah stood tall, her posture rigid, her eyes blazing with absolute clarity. She reached down to her left hand and grabbed the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring Marcus had given her. A ring he had undoubtedly purchased using stolen money or another line of fraudulent credit. She twisted the platinum band, pulling it over her knuckle in one fluid motion. "You are a sociopath," Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady and dripping with pure disgust. "You looked me in the eye every single day and lied about who you are. You went to work every morning to a hospital that did not employ you. You sat at my family's dining table and pitched my father on an investment for a commercial medical clinic that does not even exist. You were not just lying to me, Marcus. You were actively trying to scam my family out of millions of dollars to pay off your underground gambling debts. You are nothing but a cheap, pathetic con artist." She stepped forward and held her hand out over a tall flute of champagne, sitting perfectly untouched on a nearby high-top table. She opened her fingers. The heavy diamond ring dropped straight into the glass, sinking to the bottom, with a heavy muffled clink. "We are done," Sarah stated, the finality of her words echoing through the dead silent room. "Do not ever contact me or my family again." She turned her back on him completely, linking her arm through her father's. The Kensington family private security detail immediately flanked them, forming a human shield between Sarah and the Harrison family. The definitive end of the relationship sent Marcus into a total tailspin. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him. He had no job, he had no medical license, he had hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal gambling debts, and his billionaire lifeline had just walked away. He scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked at Arthur and Sarah retreating toward the exit, and his desperation boiled over into a full-blown screaming panic. "Wait!" Marcus shrieked, his voice echoing off the walls. "Arthur, wait! You do not have to leave. I can get the money. I can cover the investment myself. We are rich. My family is wealthy. We have assets." He turned frantically toward our parents, who were still standing near the stage, frozen in a state of shock. He was perfectly willing to bleed them completely dry to save his own skin. He had already stolen my college fund, and now he was coming for everything else they owned. "Mom, Dad, tell them," Marcus yelled, waving his arms like a madman. "Tell Arthur we can cover the clinic investment. We have the historic brownstone in the city. It is in the most exclusive neighborhood in Atlanta. It is worth millions of dollars. Millions. They will remortgage it for me right now. They will take out a loan against the equity to prove my good faith. Right, Dad? Tell him you will sign the papers tonight." Harrison and Vivian looked entirely cornered. The crowd was staring at them, waiting to see if they would actually sink themselves into absolute financial ruin to back their fraudulent son. And given their toxic history, I knew they were sick enough to actually consider it. They loved the illusion of status more than they loved reality, and they loved Marcus more than they loved their own survival. Vivian opened her mouth, clearly preparing to pledge the family estate to appease the angry billionaires. I did not let her speak. I set the microphone down on the wooden podium, letting out a sharp feedback whine that made several guests wince. I walked slowly down the short steps of the stage, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I ignored my parents completely and bypassed my panicking brother. I walked directly over to the lavish dessert table set up near the edge of the dance floor. I took my time. I surveyed the towering displays of imported chocolates, the delicate pastries, and the silver platters of fresh fruit. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I reached out and picked up a single perfect chocolate-covered strawberry by its green stem. I examined it for a brief second, appreciating the sheer absurdity of the extravagant display, while my family crumbled into dust. I turned around to face my brother. I took a small, deliberate bite of the strawberry. The sweet taste contrasted sharply with the bitter reality of the room. I chewed, slowly swallowed, and locked my gaze onto Marcus. "About that brownstone, Marcus," I said, my voice carrying perfectly through the silent room. Harrison did not let me finish the sentence. He surged forward, closing the distance between us with his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The veins in his neck were bulging against his stiff collar. He had just watched his golden ticket to the Kensington fortune walk out the heavy mahogany doors, and he needed someone to punish. He needed his scapegoat. "Shut your mouth, Maya!" he bellowed, his voice raw and echoing across the quiet ballroom. "Do not you dare say another word. Look at what you have done. You drove Sarah away, you ruined your brother's engagement, and you humiliated this family in front of half of Atlanta." He was pointing at the exit where Sarah and her father had just disappeared. He was completely unhinged, transferring every ounce of blame from his fraudulent son directly onto my shoulders. The crowd watched in stunned fascination as a father chose a con artist's son over a successful daughter. "If you think you are walking out of here with anything after this stunt, you are out of your mind," Harrison screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You are cut off. You will never see a dime of our money. I am writing you out of the will tonight. That brownstone has been in our family for 3 generations. It is our legacy. It is the crown jewel of the Harrison name, and you are never setting foot inside it again. It is all going to Marcus, every single brick of it. We will leverage whatever we have to fix the mess you just made. The historic brownstone in the city was the absolute center of my parents' universe. It was an architectural masterpiece, located in the most exclusive neighborhood. It was the physical manifestation of their social standing. For my entire life, that house had been held over my head as the ultimate reward and the ultimate punishment. Obey, and you get the house. Defy us, and you are cast out. The guests braced themselves, expecting me to break. They expected the dutiful daughter to finally crumble under the weight of her father's ultimate rejection. Being disinherited was the final weapon in the aristocratic arsenal, the ultimate death sentence in these social circles. But I did not crumble. I did not flinch. The space around me seemed to alter. If this were a movie, the camera would be executing a slow, sweeping parallax pan around my body, isolating me from the chaos of my family. The ambient light in the ballroom seemed to dim, leaving me standing in a sharp, focused beam. The heavy, suffocating energy of the room suddenly belonged entirely to me. My demeanor shifted from defensive to utterly dominant. I was no longer the discarded daughter begging for scraps of affection. I was the executioner, and I had just been handed the axe. I had spent years meticulously gathering my strength, building my own empire while they foolishly chipped away at theirs. I wiped a small smudge of chocolate from my thumb using a linen napkin from the dessert table. I looked at Harrison with an expression of pure clinical pity, the kind of look a doctor gives a patient whose test results have come back terminal. "You are writing me out of the will," I asked, my voice echoing through the sound system with perfect icy clarity. "You are going to leave the grand historic Harrison estate entirely to Marcus. You are going to remortgage our ancestral home to pay off his underground poker debts." "Yes," Harrison snarled, puffing out his chest. "Every last cent." I let out a soft breath, shaking my head. "The tragedy of your arrogance, Harrison, is that it blinds you to simple mathematics. You have spent your entire life treating wealth like a magic trick that bends to your will. But numbers do not care about your pride. They do not care about the Harrison legacy. You cannot bequeath an asset you no longer possess. You cannot leave a house to Marcus that you do not own." The absolute certainty in my voice made Harrison falter. He blinked, the red flush draining slightly from his cheeks. His mind tried to reject the words, but the sheer, unbothered confidence in my posture planted a seed of terrifying doubt. He looked back at Marcus, who was still sweating profusely, leaning against the stage for physical support. Vivian stepped up beside him, her face twisted into a mask of ugly, arrogant defiance. She let out a loud, abrasive scoff that cut through the tension in the room. "You are bluffing," Vivian spat, crossing her arms tightly over her designer silk dress. "You are just trying to scare us because you know you have lost. We own that brownstone free and clear. It has been paid off for decades. We have the original paper deed locked inside the heavy steel safe in my bedroom. I look at it every single week. You are making things up, Maya." I looked at my mother, a woman who cared more about a piece of paper in a safe than the daughter standing right in front of her. She was clinging to an illusion of wealth that had evaporated years ago. I tossed the linen napkin onto the table. The soft fabric landed next to a tower of untouched pastries. "A piece of paper in a safe does not dictate ownership, Vivian," I said, my tone dropping to a deadly serious whisper that commanded the attention of every person in the room. "Financial contracts do. Tell me something. When you two decided to blindly fund Marcus and his lavish fake lifestyle, when you needed hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his Caribbean tuition and his luxury sports car and his downtown penthouse, did you read the fine print on the HELOC you took out last year?" Vivian staggered backward as if the acronym itself possessed a crushing physical weight. Her flawless posture entirely dissolved, and her manicured hands dropped to her sides in sudden paralyzing defeat. She looked at Harrison, her eyes wide and pleading silently, begging him to contradict me, to spin another lie, to somehow put the pristine mask back on their shattered reality. But Harrison was frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. They both knew exactly what they had done. I turned my attention to the sea of wealthy guests standing in the ballroom. These were people who understood money. They understood leverage and assets and collateral. I was speaking their language now, and I wanted every single one of them to comprehend the absolute magnitude of my parents' financial stupidity. To fund my brother's pathetic illusion of a high society lifestyle, I announced, my voice ringing with a cold, lethal authority. Harrison and Vivian Harrison took out a massive home equity line of credit. They took a house that has been in our family for almost a century, a historic property that my great-grandfather literally built from the ground up. It survived economic depressions. It survived recessions. It survived absolutely everything until the two of you decided to use it as a personal ATM for a degenerate gambler. That was an investment, Harrison suddenly bellowed, finding a brief, fleeting surge of false courage. He stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. It was an investment in his future. He is a medical professional. He needed capital to establish his private clinic. You do not understand high-level business, Maya. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. He is a complete fraud, Harrison. And you funded his fraud with a loan secured directly by the deed you are so desperately proud of. You bet the entire Harrison legacy on a man who could not even pass his basic medical board exams. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at my mother. Vivian was staring at the floor, refusing to meet my gaze. She was trembling visibly, her designer silk dress rustling with her erratic breathing. Let us talk about family loyalty, Vivian, I said, my tone dropping to a quiet, dangerous register that commanded total silence in the room. Let us talk about exactly how tight money really is in the Harrison household. Let me refresh your memory. Think back to last Thanksgiving. Do you remember that dinner? We were all sitting around your beautiful antique dining table, eating roasted turkey off your imported crystal plates. Vivian swallowed hard, but remained completely silent. I asked you for a favor that night. I continued, stepping deliberately to the rhythm of my words. I was opening my own private neurosurgery practice. I had the business plan. I had the patient roster. I had the hospital backing. All I needed was a simple cosigner on my commercial lease. I did not ask you for a single dime of your money, Vivian. I just asked for a signature to act as a guarantor while my practice got off the ground. Do you remember what you told me? My mother closed her eyes, squeezing them shut, as if that could somehow block out the sound of my voice. You looked me dead in the eye, I said, projecting my voice to the back row of the ballroom, and you told me that money was tight. You told me you and Dad were living on a fixed retirement income and could not take on that kind of financial risk. You told me I needed to learn how to be an independent woman and stop expecting handouts from my parents. The wealthy guests murmured among themselves, shaking their heads in quiet disgust. The hypocrisy was staggering, and I was making sure everyone witnessed it. You denied me a simple signature for a legitimate medical practice, I stated, my voice rising in power and intensity. But exactly 48 hours later, you walked into a bank downtown and signed a $1.2 million HELOC for Marcus. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the affluent crowd. $1.2 million. The number hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Sarah's father, Arthur Kensington, let out a low whistle of pure revulsion, crossing his arms over his chest as he stared at Harrison with total contempt. You handed a con artist a blank check secured by our ancestral home so he could pretend to be a tycoon, I said, staring directly at my brother, who was now weeping silently near the gift table. And where did that $1.2 million go, Marcus? You did not build a clinic. You bought a luxury sports car. You bought VIP tables at nightclubs to impress your wealthy friends. You took Sarah on extravagant vacations. And you lost hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting at illegal poker tables until the money was entirely gone. You even burned through the reserve cash our parents set aside to pay the monthly minimums. I turned my back on them and walked back to the center of the stage. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and tapped the screen once. The digital projector behind me flickered and the county public records vanished. A new document loaded onto the 20-foot screen. It was a scanned legal letter printed on official bank letterhead. The text was stark and undeniable. This is a notice of default and intent to foreclose. I read aloud, ensuring my voice was steady and clinical. Documented and filed exactly 3 weeks ago. Because Marcus spent the reserve cash, you two have not made a single payment on your massive HELOC in 6 consecutive months. The bank has officially called the note due. You do not own that historic brownstone anymore, Harrison. You are completely, utterly bankrupt. The silence in the room was deafening. The illusion was completely shattered. There was no wealth. There was no legacy. There was only debt and lies and the absolute ruin they had brought upon themselves. Harrison began to sweat profusely. The red flush returned to his face, but it was driven by pure, desperate adrenaline rather than anger. He puffed up his chest, attempting to project the authority he had wielded his entire life. He pointed a shaking finger at the screen, refusing to accept the reality of his own destruction. So what? Harrison screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he tried to act tough in front of his wealthy peers. So what if we missed a few payments? It is a simple administrative error. The bank will give us an extension. I know the branch manager personally. We play golf together every single Sunday at this exact country club. I am a Harrison. I will make one phone call tomorrow morning and this entire thing goes away. We will restructure the debt and keep the house. You know nothing about how the real world works, Maya. I stood perfectly still, holding the microphone. I looked at the man who had dismissed me, rejected me, and sacrificed me at every turn. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The bank does not own your debt anymore, Dad. Harrison stared at me, his jaw going completely slack. The flush of rage on his face drained away, leaving behind a sickly pale gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The concept was entirely alien to him. He was a man who believed his last name was a magical shield against the consequences of the real world. Let me explain the brutal reality of modern finance to you, Harrison, I said, my voice projecting cleanly over the dead silence of the ballroom. You thought your country club membership and your weekly golf games with the branch manager made you untouchable. But institutional banking does not care about your handicap or your ancestral pedigree. When you default on a $1.2 million line of credit for half a year, you trigger an algorithm. You become a red flag on a balance sheet. The bank did not call you to chat over cigars. They classified your HELOC as a toxic, non-performing asset. They bundled your debt with dozens of other failing loans, and they sold it off at a steep discount to a private equity firm. They washed their hands of you months ago. The words landed like physical blows. Harrison staggered back a step, bumping into the edge of the stage for support. The untouchable patriarch of the Harrison family was suddenly looking very small, very old, and utterly powerless. Next to him, Vivian began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow jerks. The realization that the brownstone, the literal foundation of her entire social identity, was slipping out of her manicured grasp was too much for her fragile reality to process. She spun around her pearl necklace, whipping against her collarbone, and locked her eyes onto her golden boy. "Where did it go?" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with an ugly, desperate panic. She marched toward Marcus, her perfectly sculpted facade disintegrating into pure hysteria. "Where did the reserve money go, Marcus? We gave you $300,000 in liquid cash just to cover the minimum payments while your business got off the ground. Where is it?" Marcus shrank away from her, holding his hands up in a pathetic defensive gesture. The charming, confident surgeon illusion was completely dead. He was just a terrified boy backed into a corner. I had to invest it," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. "I needed to multiply it, Mom. Sarah's father was asking questions about my liquid capital. I could not just sit on it. I found a guaranteed return, a crypto venture. It was an initial coin offering. The guys running it said it was going to skyrocket. I was going to be a billionaire in a week. I was going to pay off the HELOC and buy Sarah the ring with cash. You put the mortgage of our house into a cryptocurrency scam!" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You lost our ancestral home to a computer scam. It was a rug pull. Marcus whined, tears actually streaming down his face now. They took the liquidity and vanished. I lost it all in 48 hours. I tried to win it back at the tables, but the cards went cold. I did not mean to lose the house, Mom, I swear. Vivian clutched the sides of her head, pulling at her meticulously styled hair. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The son she had worshipped, the boy she had sacrificed my entire future for, was nothing but a gullible, foolish Mark who had destroyed their lives. It was an unbearable truth. And because Vivian Harrison was fundamentally incapable of processing her own failures or the failures of her beloved son, her mind did the only thing it knew how to do. It pivoted. It sought a scapegoat. She slowly turned away from Marcus and locked her eyes on me. The panic in her face morphed instantly back into a familiar, vicious rage. Her psychological defense mechanism slammed into overdrive, overriding any sense of logic or shame. "You," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You knew about this. You stood there and watched us drown." I tilted my head, watching the sheer narcissistic delusion unfold. "If you are so rich now," Vivian yelled, taking a step toward me, her voice echoing with righteous indignation. "If you are this powerful chief of neurosurgery, making all this money, why did not you pay it for us? Why did not you cover the arrears? You could have saved the brownstone. You could have written a check and fixed this entire mess. But you hid your success from us. You let us default. You let your own flesh and blood fail just so you could humiliate us in front of these people." The sheer audacity of her logic elicited quiet gasps from the remaining guests. After spending my entire life treating me like a worthless burden, after kicking me out onto the street and demanding I commit medical fraud, she somehow still believed I owed her my salvation. She believed my hard-earned success was just another asset meant to be liquidated for Marcus. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream back. I simply walked forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing directly in Vivian's personal space. She instinctively tried to step back, but I caught her gaze and held it, pinning her in place. I looked down at the woman who had made my childhood a living hell. "I did not let you fail, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper that carried perfectly to the microphone still resting on the podium. "I bought your failure." Vivian stared at me, her mouth working soundlessly as if the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. She blinked rapidly, her brain misfiring as it attempted to process a reality that completely contradicted her entirely fabricated universe. Harrison gripped the edge of the stage, his knuckles turning translucent. He shook his head, his jowls vibrating with a mixture of terror and furious denial. "You are lying!" Harrison spat, his voice lacking its usual booming resonance. It sounded thin and hollow. "Banks do not just sell $1 million home equity line to a random private citizen. They do not sell the Harrison family estate to some vindictive little girl trying to prove a point. We have rights. We have legal protections. You cannot just buy our debt." "I did not buy it as a private citizen, Dad," I replied, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "I bought it through a corporate entity. And you are right about one thing. The bank did not care about the Harrison family estate. They did not care about your legacy, or your antique chandeliers, or the generations of aristocratic pride you have assigned to those brick walls. To them, your historic brownstone was nothing but a toxic, non-performing asset dragging down their quarterly earnings report. It was a bad loan taken out by arrogant people who stopped making payments. So they did what financial institutions always do with bad debt. They bundled it up and auctioned it off for pennies on the dollar to a private equity firm. A firm that specializes in acquiring distressed medical real estate and aggressively liquidating toxic portfolios." I paused, letting the absolute finality of the situation sink into their bones. "The bank sold your debt to Vanguard Medical Holdings," I stated clearly, articulating every single syllable. The name echoed across the ballroom. For the guests, it was just another corporate moniker, a faceless financial entity. But for my brother, it was a physical blow. Marcus let out a sound that was half gasp and half choke. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His eyes darted wildly toward Sarah and Arthur Kensington, who were still standing near the exit, absolutely captivated by the unfolding carnage. Marcus recognized the name. Of course he recognized the name. It was the exact same company he had been using to anchor his entire fraudulent existence for the past year. I turned my full attention to my brother, watching him suffocate under the weight of his own monumental stupidity. "You really should do better research when picking a fake company to pretend you work for Marcus," I said, my voice dripping with surgical mockery. He flinched as if I had struck him. "I know exactly how your mind works." I continued, taking slow, measured steps toward him. "You needed a cover story to impress the Kensingtons. You needed to sound like a high-rolling financial prodigy instead of a medical school dropout drowning in underground poker debt. So you probably sat in your rented penthouse, opened your laptop, and typed top medical private equity firms in Atlanta into a search engine. Vanguard Medical Holdings popped up at the top of the list. They have a sleek website. They have an intimidating logo. They sound prestigious. So you decided to steal their name. You went online and ordered fake premium business cards. You updated your social media profiles. You sat at country club dinners and bragged about being an executive partner orchestrating multi-million-dollar acquisitions. Marcus was physically shaking now, his hands trembling so violently he had to cross his arms tightly across his chest to hide it. "Did you ever once bother to check the public corporate registry, Marcus?" I asked, tilting my head. "Did you ever run a simple background check on the board of directors? Did you look at their recent acquisitions or their corporate structure? Because if you had possessed even a fraction of the intelligence you pretend to have, you would have realized a few critical details. Vanguard Medical Holdings does not hire undergraduate dropouts to manage their investment portfolios. They do not employ degenerate gamblers. What they actually do is buy the foreclosed properties of arrogant fools who leverage their parents' homes to fund fake lifestyles." The sheer staggering irony of the situation was almost poetic. Marcus had wrapped himself in the armor of a company that was simultaneously holding the deed to his own destruction. He had spent months bragging about his non-existent power at the exact firm that was currently orchestrating his family's financial ruin. Harrison could not take it anymore. The patriarch was short-circuiting, unable to reconcile the catastrophic failure of his son with the terrifying dominance of his daughter. The rigid walls of his reality were collapsing, and he was desperate to find a single thread of logic to cling to. He pushed himself off the stage, his face a twisted mask of desperation and fury. "What does Vanguard Medical Holdings have to do with you?" Harrison demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. He marched toward me, stopping just a few feet away. "You are a doctor, Maya. You operate on brains. You do not run a private equity firm. You do not buy distressed debt. You are bluffing. This is an elaborate bluff to ruin your brother. Tell me what Vanguard Medical Holdings has to do with you right now." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small, insignificant, and unworthy. I looked at the man who had gladly offered up my future to pave the way for his fraudulent son. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a long-winded explanation. I simply reached inside the tailored pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers found the smooth, heavy stock paper. I pulled out a sleek, matte black business card. The gold foil lettering gleamed sharply under the ballroom chandeliers. I held it between my index and middle fingers, making sure Harrison was tracking the movement. With a quick, sharp flick of my wrist, I tossed the card. It spun through the air and landed perfectly flat on the glass surface of the nearest cocktail table right between Harrison and Vivian. The sleek, matte black card hit the glass surface with a sharp, definitive snap. It slid perfectly to the center of the cocktail table, coming to rest exactly between my mother and father. For a second, nobody moved. The high society guests craned their necks, the silence in the ballroom so absolute you could hear the faint mechanical hum of the air conditioning vents. Harrison stared at the small rectangular piece of paper as if it were a live hand grenade. His trembling hand reached out, hovering over it, before finally picking it up. He squinted his eyes, tracking across the gold foil lettering. I watched his jaw slacken. I watched his pupils dilate in pure, unadulterated horror. He dropped the card. It fluttered back to the glass. Vivian snatched it up immediately, her eyes scanning the text before she physically recoiled, letting out a sharp, strangled gasp. The camera lens of the crowd focused entirely on that card. I did not need to look at it to know exactly what it said. I had designed it myself. Dr. Maya Harrison, CEO and majority shareholder, Vanguard Medical Holdings. I stepped forward, claiming the physical space they had commanded for decades. I did not just survive after you threw me out into the freezing rain, Harrison, I stated, my voice projecting cleanly through the microphone and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I thrived. You thought I was just a doctor collecting a standard hospital salary. You thought my private practice was just a little project. But while you were burning through your equity to fund Marcus and his pathetic underground poker games, I was taking my surgical salary and building a financial empire. I used my capital to launch a private equity firm. I specialized in acquiring distressed medical real estate and absorbing toxic debt portfolios. I bought out Vanguard 3 years ago. I am the sole owner. I am the majority shareholder. Harrison shook his head frantically, his hands gripping the edge of the table to keep himself upright. Vivian was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Marcus let out a whimpering sound from the floor, burying his face in his hands as the full weight of his lies crushed him. When your bank decided to dump your defaulting home equity line of credit at a bargain basement price to clean up their quarterly books, Vanguard swept in. I continued my tone, clinical and detached. My acquisition team flagged it immediately. I saw the address of the collateral. I saw your signatures on the default notices. I bought your failure for pennies on the dollar. I own your debt. No, Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with wild hysteria. No, that is illegal. You cannot do that. We are your parents. You cannot just buy our house. It is entirely legal, Vivian, I replied, looking down at her with absolute pity. It is standard corporate financial procedure. You leveraged the ancestral home. You missed 6 consecutive payments. You ignored the notices of default because Marcus intercepted the mail, or because you were simply too arrogant to believe a bank would actually follow through on a Harrison. You missed the 90-day cure period. The foreclosure was executed quietly and completely by the book. The title transferred to Vanguard Medical Holdings last week. I let the words hang in the air, allowing the gravity of their ruin to settle deep into their bones. The guests whispered among themselves, the wealthy elite recognizing the brutal efficiency of a corporate takeover. You do not own a single brick of that brownstone, I said. Legally and financially, I am the sole proprietor of the Harrison family estate. The house you have used to manipulate me my entire life, the legacy you just threatened to cut me out of, now belongs entirely to me. You are currently living in my property. You are my tenants. And considering you have not paid rent, you are technically squatting. The absolute destruction of their reality was total. Marcus was sobbing openly, now slumped against the base of the stage in his ruined tuxedo. Vivian was hyperventilating, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face as she looked around at the judging, condemning eyes of her former high society peers. The Kensington family stood near the exit watching the Harrison dynasty turn to dust. But Harrison, the grand patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist of financial manipulation, realized his entire kingdom had just been conquered by the daughter he had discarded. His mind snapped. Having lost every ounce of leverage, wealth, and power, having his profound incompetence exposed to the entire Buckhead elite, he resorted to the ultimate narcissistic manipulation tactic. He suddenly gasped loudly, his face contorting into a mask of sudden extreme agony. He clutched his left arm, bringing his right hand up to grip his chest tightly. He let out a strangled, dramatic groan and stumbled backward, collapsing heavily onto a velvet lounge chair. Vivian shrieked, dropping to her knees beside him. The guests gasped loudly, several people stepping forward in panic. Arthur Kensington barked at his security detail to call for medical assistance. The ballroom erupted into sudden, chaotic motion. "Oh my God!" Vivian screamed, her hands hovering over Harrison's heaving chest. "He is having a heart attack. Someone call an ambulance. Maya, do something. You are a doctor. Save your father." I did not rush forward. I did not drop the microphone. I did not panic. I stood exactly where I was, my posture completely relaxed, my eyes locked on the man, putting on the theatrical performance of a lifetime. I tilted my head, running a swift, practiced clinical assessment from 10 feet away. I watched the rise and fall of his chest. I looked at the capillary refill in his face. I noted the complete lack of genuine diaphoresis. Your color is fine. Your breathing is even. I stated, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room like a surgical scalpel. Stop faking, Dad. Harrison froze. His hand slowly dropped from his chest. The color rushed back into his face, not from a miraculous recovery, but from the burning heat of absolute public humiliation. The wealthy guests, who had been murmuring in rising panic, suddenly went dead silent, recognizing the pathetic theater for exactly what it was. Arthur Kensington let out a sharp, disgusted scoff and physically turned his back on my father. Harrison slouched into the velvet chair, defeated and ruined. Seeing that aggression, intimidation, and even medical theater had completely failed, Vivian shattered. The pristine matriarch of the Harrison family, the woman who had spent decades meticulously curating an image of untouchable aristocratic elegance, crumbled. She dropped to her knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. The sudden, violent movement tore the hem of her custom silk gown, but she did not care. She crawled forward, closing the remaining distance between us, and reached out with trembling manicured hands to grab the fabric of my tailored trousers. "Maya, please!" Vivian wailed. The sound was guttural and wet, a desperate animal backed into a corner of its own making. Tears ruined her immaculate makeup, leaving dark, jagged streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. "You cannot do this to us. We are your blood. We are a black family, Maya. We have to stick together. The world is already out to get us. They want to see us fall. They want to see us tear each other apart. You cannot take our home and hand it over to strangers. It is your legacy too. It is your history. I am your mother. I gave birth to you." I looked down at her hands gripping my leg. Her knuckles were white, her rings catching the light of the chandeliers. I did not step back. I did not pull away. I just stared at her. The digital camera at the back of the room, operated by the event videographer, slowly tracked in, capturing every micro-expression on my face and projecting it onto the massive screen behind me. I searched myself for a shred of empathy, a single drop of pity for the weeping, begging woman at my feet. There was nothing. Just a cold, sterile void where a daughter's love should have been. Family. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. I kept my voice low and dangerously calm, but the state-of-the-art acoustics of the silent ballroom carried every syllable perfectly to the crowd. "You want to weaponize our race and our bloodline now, Vivian. You want to talk about the world being out to get us. The world did not break me. The world did not starve me or freeze me out. You did." I looked up, meeting the eyes of the affluent guests, ensuring they heard every detail of the Harrison family reality. "Let us talk about what family means to you, Vivian. Let us go back to when I was 16. It was January, the worst blizzard Atlanta had seen in a decade. The city was completely shut down. There was black ice on the roads and power lines were snapping under the weight of the freezing rain. I had just walked 3 miles home in the dark from my after-school job at the diner because the public buses had stopped running. Vivian's grip on my trousers loosened slightly, her eyes darting away as the memory hit her. "I was freezing, Vivian." I continued, my voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. I could not feel my hands or my feet. I dragged myself up the front steps of that precious historic brownstone you are crying over right now. I reached for the brass handle, but the deadbolt was thrown. I knocked. I pounded on the thick oak door. I stood on the porch, shivering so violently my teeth cracked together. I looked down at Marcus, who was still weeping silently against the stage. I looked through the front window, and I saw Marcus sitting by the marble fireplace, drinking hot chocolate wrapped in a cashmere blanket. "And what did you do, Vivian? You came to the window. I saw you pull back the heavy velvet curtains. You looked right at me standing in the sleet, My lips were blue. My uniform was soaked through with freezing rain. And you locked eyes with me, and you let the curtain fall back into place. The collective gasp from the ballroom was audible. The high society guests, who had previously tolerated the Harrisons' arrogance, were now looking at Vivian with pure, unadulterated revulsion. You left your 16-year-old daughter on the porch in sub-freezing temperatures for 4 hours. I stated the cold facts ringing with lethal precision. Because I had disrespected Harrison that morning by daring to ask if I could use a fraction of my own diner paycheck to buy a winter coat, instead of handing the money over to help pay for Marcus and his private tennis lessons. You decided I needed a lesson in gratitude. You decided I needed to understand my place in the hierarchy of your home. Vivian was weeping silently now, her head bowed, unable to look at me or anyone else in the room. The elderly neighbor across the street had to call the police. I said, relentless in my delivery. The police had to threaten you with child endangerment and arrest before you finally opened that door. And when I walked inside, my fingers completely numb, you did not hug me. You did not wrap me in a blanket. You looked at me with absolute disgust and told me to stop tracking dirty snow onto your imported rugs. I leaned down slightly, forcing Vivian to lift her head and look me directly in the eyes. That is what family means in this house, I whispered. It means using me as a stepping stone, a punching bag, and a piggy bank. It means sacrificing my literal warmth so Marcus could play on clay courts. Do not sit on the floor and preach to me about black excellence or familial loyalty. You only care about our bloodline when it is convenient for your bank account. You only care about sticking together when you are the one facing the cold. I straightened my posture, smoothing my suit jacket. I bought this debt because it was a highly profitable business investment for Vanguard Medical Holdings. I said, my voice returning to a brisk professional cadence. But I came here tonight to personally deliver the eviction notice because it was the closure I owed that 16-year-old girl shivering on your front porch. I looked at the three of them, broken, ruined, and stripped of their illusions. The locks on the brownstone are being changed tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I announced. Vanguard Medical Holdings has already dispatched a private security team to oversee the transition. You and Harrison are allowed 2 suitcases each. Everything else, the antique furniture, the crystal, the imported rugs you love so much, legally, belongs to the firm to cover the remaining deficit of your defaulted loan. You have 12 hours to pack your bags, Vivian. I suggest you get started. Vivian refused to accept the finality of my words. She clung to the fabric of my trousers, her manicured fingernails digging into my leg like talons. She sobbed hysterically, smearing her expensive cosmetics across her face, babbling incoherently about how I was destroying our bloodline, how I was betraying my own people. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. I simply pulled my leg back with a sharp, deliberate motion. Lacking support, Vivian collapsed entirely onto the hardwood floor, a heap of ruined silk and shattered pride. That incident when I was 16 was just a preview of your cruelty, Vivian, I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the ballroom could hear the absolute truth. The real masterclass in Harrison family values happened 3 years later. I was 19 years old. It was another freak winter storm in Atlanta. The city was completely paralyzed by black ice and freezing rain. But that night, you did not just lock me out for a few hours to teach me a lesson in obedience. That night, you permanently discarded me. I paced slowly across the stage area, commanding the undivided attention of the room. Harrison refused to meet my eyes, staring blankly at the floor. You packed my entire life into 3 black plastic trash bags. I continued my words, striking the silent room like a gavel. You dragged them out to the front porch and threw them down the concrete steps into the freezing sleet. And why did you do it? Let us tell your country club friends exactly why I was violently exiled from the Harrison dynasty. I pointed a finger at my father. Harrison was drowning in bad investments even back then. He needed capital. He needed a bailout. So he found a wealthy real estate developer, a man who was 50 years old with a well-documented history of domestic violence and putting his previous wives in the hospital. But he had a massive bank account, and he had the exact business connections my father desperately craved. So Harrison offered me up as a bargaining chip. He demanded I marry a violent, abusive man twice my age to secure his own financial salvation. And when I refused, when I looked you both in the eye and told you I would rather die than be bartered like a piece of livestock, you dragged me to the door and threw me into the ice. A collective shudder rippled through the affluent crowd. Sarah's mother placed a hand over her mouth in sheer horror. Arthur Kensington glared at Harrison with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The immaculate, aristocratic facade of the Harrison family was not just cracked, it was entirely obliterated. They were exposed as monsters. You didn't care that the world was out to get me when you threw me out in the freezing rain at 19, I said, my voice dropping an octave, resonating with absolute lethal authority. You didn't care about black excellence when you mocked my education. You told me studying pre-med was a pathetic waste of time compared to marrying a rich man. You ridiculed my ambitions while you poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into Marcus and his fake businesses. You only care about blood when you need a transfusion of my money. Harrison suddenly found his voice a weak, pathetic croak from the velvet chair. Maya, please, he begged, his hands trembling. We can fix this. We can restructure the terms. I can sign the house over to you formally. We can pay rent. Just give us a chance to make it right. Do not put us on the street. I stared at him, my expression carved from stone. I am not a retail bank, Harrison. I do not negotiate with defaulting debtors, and I certainly do not negotiate with abusers. I will not forgive a single cent of this debt. The foreclosure process is already complete. The paperwork is finalized, filed, and stamped. You have absolutely no legal recourse. You are bankrupt. You are completely irrelevant. Your time is up. The silence that followed was absolute. The reality of their total annihilation settled over them like a burial shroud. But while Harrison and Vivian were paralyzed by their impending homelessness, the truth of the situation was hitting Marcus in an entirely different way. He was still sitting on the floor near the edge of the stage. He looked up slowly, his bloodshot eyes darting toward the exit. Sarah Kensington, the woman he had intended to marry, the woman whose family wealth was supposed to secure. His lavish future was staring at him with undisguised revulsion. She slipped off the engagement ring he had bought with stolen HELOC funds and dropped it onto a cocktail table. She turned her back on him and walked out the double doors, followed closely by her furious parents. Marcus watched his entire fake life evaporate. There was no wedding, there was no trust fund, there was no penthouse, there was no executive partner position at Vanguard Medical Holdings. He was a fraud, a failure, and a broke medical school dropout who had just bankrupted his parents. His fragile narcissistic ego could not sustain the sheer magnitude of his public destruction. He did not possess the psychological capacity to accept blame or process consequence. Something inside him visibly snapped. His face twisted into a mask of pure feral rage. The whimpering, terrified boy vanished, replaced by an unhinged, cornered animal. He let out a raw, guttural scream that tore through the quiet ballroom, a sound completely devoid of human reason. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes locked onto me with murderous intent. He lunged toward a silver ice bucket resting on a nearby catering table. His hand closed around the thick, heavy neck of a solid green champagne bottle. He ripped it from the ice, sending freezing water and cubes scattering across the polished floor. With a roar of blind, psychotic fury, Marcus raised the heavy glass bottle above his head and charged directly at me. The heavy green glass glinted dangerously under the crystal chandeliers as he closed the distance between us. Drops of freezing water and melting ice sprayed from the bottle, hitting the polished hardwood floor. His bespoke tuxedo jacket strained against his shoulders, his face contorted into an ugly, unrecognizable snarl of pure desperation. He intended to strike me. He intended to shatter that heavy vintage champagne bottle directly against my skull. I did not take a single step backward. I did not raise my hands to protect my face. I did not even blink. I knew my brother better than he knew himself. I knew that beneath the tailored suits, the expensive colognes, and the carefully curated charm, he was nothing more than a volatile, petulant child. When his charm failed him, he resorted to manipulation. When manipulation failed him, he resorted to deceit. And now that his deceit had been brutally publicly exposed, he was resorting to the only tool he had left, mindless primitive violence. He covered half the distance in a fraction of a second, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the wet floor. He brought the bottle higher, ready to swing. He never even made it within striking distance. Before Marcus could cross the invisible boundary of my personal space, two massive shadows detached themselves from the perimeter of the ballroom. I had stationed my private corporate security team in the blind spots of the room long before the first guest had even arrived. They were ex-military professionals employed by Vanguard Medical Holdings, highly trained, heavily armed, and entirely lacking in patience for spoiled heirs, throwing violent tantrums. They moved with terrifying fluid precision. The first guard hit Marcus directly in the chest with the force of a freight train, stopping his forward momentum dead in its tracks. The air left Marcus's lungs in a loud, wet wheeze. The second guard hit him from the side, executing a flawless tactical takedown. The champagne bottle flew from Marcus's grip. It sailed through the air and smashed spectacularly against the base of a marble pillar. Thick shards of green glass exploded outward, raining down across the dance floor in a glittering, deadly shower. Puddles of expensive vintage champagne seeped into the polished wood, mingling with the melting ice. Marcus slammed into the floor hard. The sickening thud of his body hitting the hardwood echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Before he could even draw a breath to scream, the two massive guards had him completely immobilized. One drove a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him flat against the ground directly amidst the scattered shards of broken glass. The other guard wrenched Marcus's arms painfully behind his back, twisting his wrists at an angle that immediately neutralized any further resistance. Marcus thrashed wildly, his expensive tuxedo tearing at the seams. He kicked his legs and spat obscenities, his cheek pressed flush against the damp floor. "Let me go!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with hysterical rage. "Get your hands off me, you animals! Do you know who I am? I will ruin you. I will have you destroyed." The guards did not respond. They did not even look at him. They simply applied an extra fraction of pressure to his spine, silencing his threats with a sharp gasp of pain. The ballroom was an absolute pandemonium. The carefully curated high society event had devolved into a scene of chaotic violence. Guests were screaming, backing away from the center of the room to avoid the shattered glass and the struggling man on the floor. Women clutched their pearls, and men pulled their wives behind them. Arthur Kensington stood near the exit, shielding Sarah, his face a mask of absolute, unadulterated disgust as he looked down at the man who had almost married his daughter. Harrison was still slumped in his velvet chair, paralyzed by the sheer, unprecedented magnitude of the disaster. He clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, unable to process the destruction of his dynasty. But Vivian could not remain silent. Seeing her golden child pinned to the floor like a common criminal, she scrambled to her feet. She ignored the fact that her silk dress was ruined, that her makeup was smeared down her face, that she had just been exposed as a bankrupt squatter living on stolen equity. Her deep-seated aristocratic delusion overrode her sense of reality. She still believed she was the untouchable matriarch of the Harrison family. She still believed her voice carried ultimate authority in this city. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors at the entrance of the country club ballroom swung open with a resounding crack that cut through the noise of the crowd. 3 uniformed police officers marched into the room. Their duty belts were heavy with equipment, their expressions hard and uncompromising. The flashing red and blue lights of their cruisers reflected visibly through the tall glass windows, casting eerie shadows across the panicked faces of the elite guests. The crowd parted for them, immediately stepping aside to create a wide, clear path straight toward the stage. Vivian saw the badges, and her eyes lit up with a wild, desperate hope. She believed salvation had arrived. She believed the authorities had come to restore order, to protect the wealthy, and to punish the daughter who dared to disrupt their perfect kingdom. She lunged forward, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face. "Arrest her!" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. "Officers, arrest this woman immediately. She is trespassing on private property. She's threatening my family. She brought these thugs into this country club and they just violently attacked my son. Look at him. Look at what they are doing to him. I want her in handcuffs right now. I demand you arrest her." She stood tall, her chest heaving, expecting the officers to immediately draw their weapons and follow her commands. She expected them to recognize her authority. The three police officers did not even break their stride. They ignored Vivian completely. They walked right past her outstretched finger without so much as a glance in her direction. Vivian's jaw dropped, her commands evaporating into the stunned silence of the room as she realized she was entirely invisible to them. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor, walked straight past my mother and stopped exactly where my private security team had Marcus pinned to the floor. He looked down at the thrashing, weeping man, covered in spilled champagne and shattered glass. The officer reached to his utility belt. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs being unholstered rang out with devastating clarity. He looked directly at the back of my brother's head. "Marcus Harrison Jr., the officer stated, his voice booming with absolute, unyielding legal authority. "You are under arrest." The cold metal closed around Marcus's wrists with a harsh, ratcheting sound. He went completely limp, the adrenaline of his attempted attack vanishing the second the steel bit into his skin. He looked up at the officer, his face pale and slick with spilled champagne and sweat. "Arrest me?" he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "For what? I did not even hit her. She provoked me. This is a private event." The lead officer did not spare a single glance for the shattered glass, the ruined tuxedo, or the spilled alcohol pooling on the floor. "We are not here for the property damage, Mr. Harrison," the officer stated, his voice echoing in the dead-silent ballroom. "We are here on behalf of the Kensington family." The name dropped like a lead weight. I watched Marcus physically shrink, pulling his shoulders up to his ears as the remaining color drained entirely from his face. Sarah Kensington had not just walked out of those mahogany double doors to cry in her car. She was the daughter of a ruthless corporate family, and she had reacted with the exact same lethal precision I had used. She had walked straight into the country club parking lot, gotten into her vehicle, and immediately dialed her father's corporate legal team and the fraud division of the Atlanta Police Department. "We have a sworn statement and digital evidence provided 15 minutes ago confirming that you forged Sarah Kensington's signature on a $250,000 commercial loan application," the officer continued, pulling Marcus up to his feet by his biceps. "You used her name and credit to secure fraudulent funding for a private medical clinic that does not exist. You are being charged with felony wire fraud, identity theft, and uttering forged documents." Marcus began to hyperventilate. His knees gave out, forcing the two assisting officers to hold his dead weight upright. "No, no, no," he wept, the sophisticated surgeon facade entirely stripped away, revealing the terrified, incompetent fraud underneath. "It was just a bridge loan. I was going to pay it back. Sarah knew I needed the capital. She was going to be my wife. You cannot do this to me. You have the right to remain silent." The lead officer recited, his voice an impassive drone cutting through Marcus's pathetic sobbing. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Marcus thrashed weakly, turning his tear-streaked face toward our parents. "Mom, Dad, do something. Call our lawyers. Tell them it is a mistake. Do not let them take me." Harrison stepped forward on pure instinct, decades of patriarchal arrogance briefly overriding his current reality. "Officers, there is a severe misunderstanding here," he declared, puffing out his chest. "I am Dr. Harrison. I know the police commissioner. Let my boy go and I will have my legal team sort out this financial dispute in the morning." The lead officer looked at Harrison with an expression of mild pity mixed with firm professional detachment. "Your son has committed multiple federal felonies, sir. There is no sorting this out in the morning. He is being taken to county lockup and bail will be set at his arraignment. If you want to help him, I suggest you secure a very good defense attorney immediately." Harrison stopped dead in his tracks. I watched the exact moment his brain calculated the brutal math. A good defense attorney required a massive retainer. A retainer required liquid capital. Harrison had absolutely nothing. His accounts were overdrawn, his credit lines were frozen, his reputation was shattered, and his ancestral home now belonged entirely to me. The great patriarch, who had solved every one of Marcus's catastrophic failures with a checkbook, was completely financially impotent. He had burned through his entire fortune funding the illusion of his golden boy, and now that his son was facing federal prison, he did not have a single dollar to his name. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He slowly backed away, abandoning his son to the authorities. Vivian let out a strangled shriek, crawling across the floor toward the officers. "Marcus, my baby, you cannot take him to a jail. He is a surgeon. He is a Harrison. We are good people." The officers ignored her dramatics entirely. They firmly marched Marcus toward the exit. He was sobbing openly now, his shoulders heaving, a broken man being paraded through the center of the country club ballroom. The very people who had toasted his engagement 20 minutes prior now pulled out their smartphones, recording his humiliating exit in handcuffs. The high society elite, who had humored my parents for years, watched with cold, fascinated judgment as the Harrison golden child was dragged out like a common criminal. The flashes from their phone cameras illuminated his tear-soaked face, capturing his ruin for the entire city to see. The doors closed behind the police, leaving a deafening heavy silence in their wake. The guests began to quickly and quietly gather their coats and evening bags, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of our family's collapse. Nobody offered their sympathies. Nobody stopped to pat Harrison on the shoulder. They slipped out into the night, abandoning the Harrisons as quickly as the Harrisons had always abandoned anyone who ceased to be useful. Harrison sat back down in the velvet chair, staring blankly at the far wall. He looked 20 years older, his posture collapsed, his hands shaking in his lap. He was a hollow shell of a man, stripped of his pride, his wealth, and his legacy. Vivian remained on the floor, surrounded by shattered green glass and the ruins of her immaculate life. She did not attempt to fix her torn dress or wipe the running mascara from her face. She slowly turned her head and looked up at me. The venom, the arrogance, the aristocratic entitlement were completely gone. Her eyes were hollow, completely devoid of hope, manipulation, or malice. She looked at the daughter she had thrown into the freezing rain, the daughter who now owned everything she had ever valued, and asked a single trembling question. "Where are we supposed to go?" I let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her question to hang in the empty space where her golden child used to stand. I looked at her ruined silk dress, her smeared mascara, and the utter devastation of a woman who had spent her entire life stepping on the necks of others to ensure her own elevation. "That is not my concern, Vivian," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of the warmth she was desperately seeking. "For 34 years you made it abundantly clear that my survival was entirely my own problem. I am simply returning the favor." I reached into the slim black clutch tucked under my arm. The snap of the metal clasp echoed sharply in the quiet room. I withdrew a crisp, white legal envelope. It was thick, heavy with the weight of absolute finality. I did not kneel to hand it to her. I held it out, forcing her to reach up with her trembling diamond-clad fingers to take it from me. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely registering above a shallow, ragged breath. "This is your official 7-day notice to vacate the premises." I stated the clinical detachment of a corporate landlord, replacing any trace of the daughter she once knew. As I mentioned earlier, the legal locks on the estate are being changed. I am giving you exactly 1 week to coordinate the removal of your permitted personal items. After that 72-hour window closes, anything left inside the property becomes the physical asset of Vanguard Medical Holdings. Vivian clutched the heavy envelope to her chest, as if the thick paper might physically shield her from the reality of her eviction. "You are throwing us into the street to sell our home, to profit off our ruin." "I am not selling the brownstone," I corrected her, allowing a faint razor-thin smile to finally touch my lips. "The Harrison estate has stood as a monument to generational wealth and aristocratic exclusion for over a century. You hosted lavish galas there to impress the exact same people who just watched your son get hauled away in handcuffs. You used that house to intimidate, to control, and to manipulate everyone who walked through its heavy oak doors. I think it is time the property actually served a meaningful purpose." I paused, letting her brace for the impact of the incoming blow. The demolition crews are scheduled to arrive next Monday morning. I continued smoothly, my words measured and precise. The interior is being entirely gutted. We are knocking down the walls of your precious formal dining room and taking sledgehammers to your imported marble foyer. The brownstone is being completely converted into a state-of-the-art, fully funded free medical clinic, specializing in maternal and pediatric care for low-income women of color. Vivian literally choked on her own breath. The physical recoil was so violent, she nearly toppled over backward. The ancestral home, the absolute crown jewel of her carefully curated social standing, was going to be torn apart and open to the very people she had spent her entire life trying to avoid, marginalize, and oppress. The poetic justice of the destruction was absolute, and I watched it shatter the last remaining piece of her aristocratic sanity. "You cannot destroy the house!" Harrison suddenly rasped from his chair, his voice weak, rattling with a desperate, hollow panic. "It is a historical landmark. It is our legacy. You cannot just erase us." "It is my property," I corrected him, without even turning to look his way. "And my legal team has already secured all the necessary zoning permits from the city council." The local government was actually quite thrilled to support a philanthropic healthcare initiative in that highly gentrified district. "Your legacy is over, Harrison. I am rewriting it with a wrecking ball." I turned my attention fully to the man who had ruled our family through financial terror and emotional blackmail. He was trembling violently, his manicured hands gripping the padded armrests of the velvet chair as if he were holding on for dear life. The custom-tailored tuxedo hung loosely on him, now the grand, intimidating patriarch entirely reduced to a terrified, bankrupt old man facing the absolute collapse of his empire. I reached into my clutch one final time. I bypassed the remaining legal documents and pulled out a glossy, brightly colored trifold brochure. I stepped toward him, closing the distance, and dropped the pamphlet directly onto his lap. Harrison flinched as the light paper landed on his thighs. He stared at it, his bloodshot eyes darting from the vibrant cover to my face and back again. Slowly, with hands that shook so badly, he could barely pinch the paper, he picked it up. He squinted at the bold, cheerful lettering printed across the front panel. I watched his eyes track the words. He stared at the bright text that read, "Community College Extension Program. How to re-enter the workforce after 60. His jaw slacked. A deep, mottled red flush crept up his neck, swallowing the pale, sickly pallor of his ruined face. He looked at me, his expression a pathetic mixture of profound shock and deeply wounded pride. He opened his mouth, but the sheer indignity of the object in his hands rendered him completely mute. "You have no liquid assets." "Harrison," I pointed out, my tone entirely conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than his total financial ruin. "Your credit score is completely incinerated. Your bank accounts are seized. You are heavily implicated in Marcus and his fraudulent loan application, which means the federal government will be auditing every single transaction you have made over the last decade. You are going to need a reliable source of income to survive, let alone pay for the federal defense attorneys Marcus is going to desperately need." He stared at the brochure as if it were a venomous snake, his thumb trembling against the glossy paper. "You always loved to lecture me about education." I continued pacing slowly around his chair, my heels clicking methodically against the polished floor. "You told me my medical degree was a pathetic waste of time. You told me that academia was for people who did not understand how real power operated in the real world. You demanded I drop out of college to marry a violent, abusive man twice my age, just so you could leverage his corporate business connections for your own failing portfolios." I stopped directly in front of him, forcing him to look up into my eyes. The absolute chilling peace I felt in that moment radiated through my entire body. Decades of anxiety, of seeking his approval, of fearing his wrath had completely evaporated, leaving behind a crystalline, unbreakable clarity. "Since you both believe degrees do not matter, I am sure you will find minimum wage character building." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for Harrison to find his voice, or for Vivian to summon another theatrical tear. The conversation was permanently, definitively over. The transaction was complete. I walked away, leaving them completely paralyzed, amidst the scattered ruins of their shattered dynasty. The physical act of turning around felt like severing a heavy iron chain that had been anchored to my spine since birth. As I began my descent from the raised stage area, the ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp, confident cadence of my heels striking the polished hardwood floor. I moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. I did not look back. I knew exactly what I was leaving behind. A bankrupt patriarch clutching a community college brochure. A delusional matriarch kneeling in spilled champagne and shattered glass. A golden child currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser facing federal prison. I walked directly through the center of the ballroom. The affluent guests, the country club elite who had spent years looking down their noses at me, parted like the Red Sea. They scrambled to get out of my way, stepping over one another in their haste to avoid making eye contact. These were the same people who had snickered when my mother called me a disappointment. These were the same people who had happily attended Marcus's lavish fake engagement parties. Now they pressed themselves against the velvet wallpaper, clutching their expensive drinks, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer, unadulterated awe and terror. I did not offer them a single glance. I did not acknowledge their gasps or their frantic whispering. I simply glided past them, my head held high, completely untouched by their panic. Their judgment had once felt like a crushing weight. Now it was entirely irrelevant. They were ghosts haunting a graveyard that I had just successfully demolished. I was the architect of my own salvation, and they were merely spectators to my masterpiece. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom loomed ahead. I pushed through them, stepping out of the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of the country club and into the grand foyer. The air here was cooler, but it still carried the faint, cloying scent of old money and desperation. I bypassed the coat check, and I bypassed the valet stand. I walked straight through the main entrance and out the massive glass doors. The contrast was immediate and profound. I stepped out into the warm, breezy Atlanta night. The heavy, humid air wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. The suffocating tension of the ballroom vanished instantly, replaced by the rhythmic, soothing hum of the city. Cicadas chirped in the manicured hedges lining the driveway. The thick scent of pine and magnolia blossoms washed over me, replacing the smell of fear and spilled alcohol. My private driver was waiting exactly where I had instructed him to be. The immaculate black luxury town car idled silently at the base of the grand stone steps, its sleek, dark exterior gleaming under the amber glow of the portico lights. As I approached, my driver immediately stepped forward, his posture impeccably professional. He opened the heavy, reinforced rear door for me without saying a single word. He did not ask how the evening went. He did not need to. He simply offered a respectful nod and gestured for me to step inside. I slid into the cavernous back seat, the supple leather yielding softly beneath me. The heavy door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, instantly sealing me inside a quiet, impenetrable fortress. The chaos, the screaming, the pathetic begging, it was all completely gone. The driver smoothly put the car into gear, and we glided away from the country club, leaving the flashing blue and red police lights far behind in the rearview mirror. I settled back into the deep leather, taking a slow, steady breath. My hands were perfectly still. My heart beat with a calm, steady rhythm. The adrenaline that had carried me through the evening was slowly receding, leaving behind a profound, deep-seated tranquility. I reached out and opened the small chilled compartment built into the center console. I withdrew a heavy crystal tumbler and a bottle of premium sparkling water. The simple, mundane act of pouring the water felt incredibly grounding. The crisp, clean fizz of the bubbles popping against the glass was the only sound in the cabin. I took a slow, deliberate sip, the cold water washing away the last lingering taste of the Harrison family venom. I tapped the digital control panel resting on the armrest. The oppressive, echoing noise of my mother's screaming, of my father's pathetic bargaining, was instantly washed away. Smooth, triumphant neo-soul music swelled softly through the high-fidelity speakers. The deep, rich bass and the soulful, confident vocals filled the cabin, wrapping around me in a warm, protective layer of sound. It was the sound of victory. It was the sound of survival. I turned my head and looked out the tinted passenger window. We were merging onto the highway, speeding back toward the heart of the city. The vibrant, glittering lights of the Atlanta skyline smeared into long, colorful streaks across the dark glass. The city was alive, pulsing with energy and ambition. For the first time in my 34 years, I felt entirely connected to that energy. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was no longer the scapegoat, the bargaining chip, or the black sheep. I had walked into the lion's den completely unarmed, and I had emerged as the undisputed owner of the entire jungle. I had reclaimed my stolen equity. I had exposed their fraudulent existence. I had secured my absolute financial and emotional independence. The chains were gone. The debt was settled. The past was permanently buried. I watched my own reflection floating faintly in the dark glass superimposed over the rushing city lights. I looked calm. I looked powerful. I looked exactly like the woman I had fought so desperately to become. A woman who required no validation, who tolerated no disrespect, and who owned her empire outright. I closed my eyes, letting the neo-soul music wash over me, letting the gentle swaying motion of the town car lull me into a state of absolute chilling peace. I was free. I was finally, completely, undeniably free. The blurred streaks of amber and gold streetlights reflecting in the tinted window began to slow down, gently morphing and shifting focus. The rhythmic hum of the highway tires faded away, replaced by the profound, absolute silence of extreme elevation. I opened my eyes. The reflection in the glass was no longer moving. The glass itself had transformed. It was no longer the window of a luxury town car. It was the massive floor-to-ceiling panoramic window of my modern penthouse living room, looking out over the exact same glittering Atlanta skyline where my story began. The faint hum of the city traffic hundreds of feet below was completely eclipsed by the sharp, clean clink of a single ice cube striking the side of a heavy crystal tumbler. I sat back against the plush velvet of my sofa, gently swirling the amber bourbon in my glass. The liquid caught the ambient light from the city, creating warm, golden reflections across the dark wood of the coffee table. I was exactly where I started, but the air in the room felt entirely different. It was lighter. It was pristine. It belonged entirely to me. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, savoring the smoky burn as it slid down my throat. Then I lowered the glass and looked directly at you. We need to have a very honest conversation about the mule. Society loves to casually throw around phrases like strong black woman as if it is the ultimate compliment, as if it is a glittering badge of honor we should wear with pride. But in families like mine, that phrase is not a compliment. It is a utility. It is an unwritten expectation that you will absorb every ounce of generational trauma, every financial failure, every toxic secret, and carry it quietly on your back. You are expected to be the mule. You are expected to lower your head, suppress your own brilliant ambitions, and let the family ride your sacrifices across the finish line. When I refused to carry their debt, when I refused to marry a violent abuser simply to bail out my father's catastrophic investments, I ceased to be a daughter. I became a defective asset. I became a threat to the illusion. They demanded my silence and my absolute compliance because the patriarchal structure of the Harrison dynasty required a sacrificial lamb to survive. But I refused the altar. Then there is the golden child, the fragile, incompetent prince who is handed the keys to the kingdom without ever having to learn how to unlock a single door. Protecting a golden child like Marcus does not save them. It inevitably destroys them. It robs them of accountability, of resilience, of the basic human capacity to survive the real world. My parents poured millions of dollars and infinite praise into a bottomless pit of mediocrity simply because he carried the family name and possessed the right gender. They enabled his delusions, shielded him from consequence, and funded his profound arrogance until his delusions required federal wire fraud to sustain themselves. The golden child dynamic is a poison that rots the family tree from the roots up. That is exactly why your own capital is your only true shield. Financial independence is not just about buying luxury penthouses or pouring vintage bourbon on a Tuesday night. It is the absolute fundamental right to say no. It is the ultimate power to walk away from toxic bloodlines without freezing in the cold. When you have your own money, you do not have to negotiate with abusers. You do not have to endure gaslighting. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into rooms where you are not respected. You can afford to enforce your boundaries with lethal, unyielding precision. Money is not just currency. For women who are told their only value lies in submission, money is armor. And my armor proved completely impenetrable. It has been 14 months since that night at the country club, and the dust has permanently settled. Marcus did not get a high-priced miracle-working defense attorney. He got an overworked public defender who quickly advised him to take a plea deal. He is currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. There are no velvet chairs, no tailored tuxedos, and certainly no vintage champagne bottles in his cell block. He has 5 years to sit in an 8x10 concrete box and think about the clinic he tried to build with stolen ink. As for Harrison and Vivian, the transition to reality was brutal. The universe possesses a tremendous sense of poetic irony. My parents now rent a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a run-down complex out in the deep suburbs. They both work full-time retail jobs just to make ends meet. The great patriarch who sneered at my medical degree, who thought hard work was beneath him, now spends 40 hours a week scanning barcodes, bagging discounted merchandise, and asking customers if they want to apply for a store credit card with an aching back. Vivian, who thought she owned the city, stands on her feet for minimum wage wearing a stiff polyester uniform, completely invisible to the wealthy women she used to rule. When her old country club friends walk into her store, they look right past her. They are finally experiencing the grinding, desperate struggle they mocked me for enduring. Meanwhile, the Harrison brownstone no longer exists. The walls were gutted, the imported marble was stripped, and the space was entirely transformed. Today, it operates as a fully funded state-of-the-art medical clinic specializing in maternal and pediatric care for low-income women of color. The very rooms where my mother hosted her elitist exclusionary galas are now filled with bright colors, the sound of healthy babies and women receiving the high-quality care they truly deserve. The building finally has genuine value. It is saving lives instead of destroying them. I took one final sip of my bourbon, setting the heavy crystal glass down onto the table. The ice shifted, settling into the amber liquid with a soft, melodic chime. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, looking straight through the lens with absolute chilling peace. They told me to find a husband to secure my future. I decided to build an empire instead. Protect your peace, ladies, and always keep your receipts. I held the gaze for a long, silent beat before leaning back into the deep shadows of the velvet sofa. The camera slowly began to pull back. It drifted smoothly in a majestic, continuous sweep, moving away from my face, sliding past the modern furniture, and slipping seamlessly right through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. It kept moving outward, suspending in the cool night air, pulling higher and further away. It lingered on the vast, glittering expanse of the Atlanta skyline, the city I had completely conquered, spreading out endlessly into the dark. The golden lights pulsed like a heartbeat against the night sky, before slowly, gracefully fading to absolute black. The greatest lesson from this story is that your true worth is never determined by those who refuse to see it. For years, Maya was the family's scapegoat, enduring constant disrespect and financial exploitation. However, she proved that genuine power comes from building your own independence. Toxic family dynamics thrive on control and manipulation, but financial freedom becomes an impenetrable shield. You do not owe loyalty to people who treat you as an asset rather than a human being. If this powerful journey of resilience resonated with you, please remember to like, subscribe, and share your story with us below.